In late 1917, after the Bolshevik Party seized power in Russia, the famous Russian Orientologist Sergei Oldenburg met with Vladimir Lenin in St. Petersburg. The two had already met more than 2 decades before in 1891. Back then, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, who did not yet call himself Lenin, visited the city for his final exams and took the opportunity to learn more about his older brother, Alexander Ulyanov, who had traveled in the same intellectual circles as Oldenburg in the 1880s before being executed for an attempted assassination of the Tsar. By 1917, Oldenburg was a member of the Constitutional Democratic Party and a self-declared constitutional monarchist. He and his colleagues were well aware of the fact that the Bolsheviks saw them as class enemies. Yet, rather than fleeing Russia or joining the Whites, they concluded that collaboration with the new Bolshevik government offered the best path forward. Indeed, the relatively small Bolshevik party was in dire need of experts in all areas, and Lenin accepted the offer from Oldenburg. The Orientologists from the Russian Academy of Sciences would become the core of the Soviet ethnographers, who became indispensable for the Bolshevik project of state building and the implementation of Lenin's nationalities policy. Lenin was known for taking the nationalities question more seriously than other Marxists. The growing importance of this issue was already visible during the 1905 revolution, when some demonstrations took on a distinctly nationalist character. And the creation of a parliament increased the visibility of parties organized along national lines, even if they remained politically marginal. The Paris Peace Conference of 1919 further elevated the principle of nationality and national self-determination on the international stage. Faced with these developments, the Bolsheviks could not rely solely on the traditional Marxist expectation that nations would simply disappear with the end of capitalism. Instead, they had to confront the nationalities question as an immediate and practical political problem. Lenin argued that all oppressed peoples had the right to national self-determination and sharply condemned the exploitative colonial practices of the European empires. However, during the Russian Civil War, the Bolsheviks became acutely aware that the survival of the new Soviet state depended on access to the natural resources located in the empire's peripheral regions. After Lenin pushed for the reconquest of the former territories of the Russian Empire, the Red Army secured key resource areas. The oil fields in the Caucasus and the cotton-producing regions of Central Asia were taken from local non-Bolshevik socialists, Muslim guerrilla forces, the White Army, and a small British military presence. Resource extraction was unavoidable in the formation of a new empire, but the Bolsheviks claimed that it would take a fundamentally different form from imperial colonialism. They envisioned a non-imperialist or non-exploitative colonialism that would promote economic development, benefit the local population, and ultimately guide these regions towards socialism, which they understood as an inherently non-exploitative social system. For this reason, the Bolsheviks sharply distanced themselves from European imperialism. Even when they used the term colonialism to describe the Soviet periphery, they insisted that it referred to a qualitatively different project. The two central pillars of this anti-imperialist empire were economic development and the formal right of national self-determination. Unlike more orthodox Marxists, who tended to emphasize that only changes in the economic base would eventually transform society and culture, the Bolsheviks pursued economic, social, and cultural transformation simultaneously. In her book, The Empire of Nations, on which this video is based, the historian Francine Hirsch argues that Soviet nationalities policy went beyond merely recognizing the right of national self-determination. Instead, it promoted what she calls state-sponsored evolutionism, that is, a program in which the state actively encouraged or initiated the nation-building of the USSR's many peoples. The goal was to mobilize popular support for the Soviet project, or at least to reduce resistance in the empire's peripheral regions. To carry out this ambitious project, however, the Bolsheviks required detailed knowledge about these populations, knowledge they largely did not possess. Most Bolshevik leaders were ethnic Russians from the western parts of the former empire, and most non-Russian party members were themselves highly westernized and Russified. In the first decade after the Bolshevik seizure of power, the small party heavily relied on non-communist experts that were commonly referred to as bourgeois specialists. With the exception of a few core institutions, such as the political police, these specialists could be found throughout the new Soviet administration. Among them were members of the Imperial Russian Geographical Society, an academic organization founded under the Tsarist regime to study the lands and peoples of the Russian Empire. Trained largely before the revolution and often educated in Europe, they were well acquainted with the politics of empire and nationalism. These scholars possessed the knowledge and practical experience the Bolsheviks desperately needed. To keep things simple, I use the word ethnographers in this video, although in practice this group included historians, linguists, statisticians, archaeologists, geographers, anthropologists, and ethnologists. Their methods and theoretical approaches, terminology and political loyalties varied considerably. These scientists provided the cultural technology of rule, that is, the forms of enumeration, mapping, and surveying that modern states use to order and understand a complicated human and geographical landscape. While European empires often used ethnographic knowledge to foster opposition between colonizers and colonized, the Bolsheviks wanted to use it to eliminate this opposition. They saw their nationalities policy as a complement to their methods of force and coercion, and as a way to integrate the empire's diverse populations into the Soviet project. As I've shown in another video, the Bolsheviks eventually used this ethnographic knowledge to construct a new distinction, that between loyal Soviet nations and suspect diaspora nations. The collaboration between the imperial ethnographers and the Bolsheviks was primarily motivated by the ethnographers' desire to preserve Russia's scientific institutions. At the same time, there were also some ideological overlaps. Oldenburg and his colleagues were critics of the Tsarist regime and supported the idea of a modern, more scientifically informed system of governance. They also shared with Bolshevik leaders the broader intellectual orientation toward modern Europe and evolutionary thinking. This convergence was not coincidental. The anthropologists Lewis Henry Morgan and Edward B. Tylor, who were among the most influential advocates of the idea that all societies develop through successive stages, shaped both the discipline of ethnography and the thoughts of Marx and Engels. Tylor himself even met with ethnographers from the Russian Empire during his visit to St. Petersburg. After Oldenburg met Lenin in November 1917, a sustained cooperation between imperial ethnographers and the Bolshevik leadership took shape. Ethnographers assisted the new Soviet government in negotiating peace treaties and defining borders with neighboring states. They produced maps to organize industry and resource extraction, assessed which local populations were considered suitable for industrial labor, conducted censuses, delineated ethnic territories, and advised officials on the practical implementation of the nationalities policy. During the First World War, the major Western empires became acutely aware that national movements could be used as a political weapon to weaken rival states. Germany, for example, applied this strategy in Eastern Europe against the Russian Empire by supporting Finnish, Ukrainian, and Jewish activists. The Entente powers likewise sought to provoke national unrest within the empires of their enemies. In this context, ethnographic knowledge gained strategic importance both to defend and attack. Yet, although ethnographers were often funded by the state, they frequently pursued their own agendas. For example, some of the imperial Orientologists explicitly supported nation-building projects among the minorities. As a result, the Tsarist government never fully trusted imperial ethnographers, whom it regarded as unreliable and potentially sympathetic to separatist causes. Instead, it tended to rely more heavily on local governor-generals and military statisticians. For the Soviet ethnographers, the theoretical and practical challenges were immense. They had to answer questions like, what is a people, a nation, a tribe, an ethnicity? The answers they produced were not merely academic. They shaped administrative borders, political rights, and the lives of millions. Nations had the right to self-determination, but which groups could be categorized as nations? What should be the primary ethnographic factors in identifying a real nation? A common language, belief system, way of life, physical appearance, psychic mentality, economic life, folklore, shared territory? Whenever a primary factor was chosen, 100 counterexamples popped up that questioned the validity of the choice. Language was often treated as the most important marker of national identity, yet this approach quickly ran into difficulties. Would it imply, for example, that the English and the Irish constituted a single nation, since most Irish people spoke English? The geographer Simeonov Tianchansky gave his colleagues an example to contemplate. What is the nationality of a woman who has always lived in the part of Russia populated by the Finnish peoples, whose parents are English and German, but who herself was educated in Russian schools and speaks English and Russian? Similar tensions emerged at the level of methodology. Ethnographic theory at the time drew on a heterogeneous and often contradictory mix of ideas, including romantic notions of a Volksgeist, racial theories, models of cultural evolution, and linguistic approaches such as Marr's Japhethic hypothesis. During the formation of the Soviet Union, two competing paradigms emerged over how the new state should be organized. The ethnographic paradigm held that nationality should be the primary principle for structuring the Soviet Federation, while the economic paradigm emphasized economic rationality. The most powerful supporters of the economic paradigm was Gosplan, the State Planning Committee, while Narkomnat, the People's Commissariat of Nationalities, advocated the ethnographic principle. Narkomnat, which was led by the People's Commissar for Nationalities Joseph Stalin, reached out to local populations and helped the Bolsheviks broker alliances with the new self-identified national leaders. It also helped facilitate local-level coups, installing local leaders who were either sympathetic to the Bolsheviks or prepared to trade their allegiance for Bolshevik backing. Through these efforts, the Bolsheviks gained a foothold in regions without local communists. While Stalin was preoccupied with other pressing issues, lower-level administrators of Narkomnats fought for the ethnographic paradigm. For most members of Narkomnats, ignoring the rights of nations was seen as an expression of imperialism. Local national representatives supported the Soviet regime in anticipation of national self-determination and territorial autonomy, and they were confident that the ethnographic paradigm would prevail. However, the topic was still hotly debated. In summer 1921, when the new economic policy was implemented, Gosplan developed a competing plan for organizing the Soviet Federation based on an economic paradigm. Supporters of the economic paradigm argued that the former empire should be divided into administrative units based on a scientific assessment of local productive forces. They maintained that the national idea should not take priority, since nations would gradually dissipate once favorable economic conditions were established. They also worried that privileging the ethnographic approach could hinder economic development. Under this plan, oblasts would be organized according to the natural division of labor among agriculture, industry, and resource extraction. Additionally, each oblast was intended to be economically self-sufficient and capable of meeting the basic needs of its inhabitants without relying heavily on other regions. Goskolonit, the State Colonization Research Institute, was established in 1922 to provide expertise on the colonial question. It was tasked by Gosplan with formulating a philosophical framework for Soviet colonization and develop a Soviet colonization code. Goskolonit's research was based on detailed geographical and demographic studies provided by Soviet ethnographers. Initially, Bolsheviks engaged in a civilizing mission rhetoric. They claimed that while a Soviet state would extract resources and products from the periphery, it would also bring the benefits of civilization. In a 1920 speech, Grigory Zinoviev declared that the Soviet regime took these products, which are necessary for us, not as former exploiters, but as older brothers bearing the torch of civilization. However, most Bolshevik leaders were concerned that local populations did not perceive a clear distinction between kolonizacja and kolonizatorstwa. Goskolony's argument drew on the familiar rhetoric of the civilizing mission, but incorporated distinctively socialist ideas. The Institute emphasized the distinction between the colonial exploitation of a dominant people and the planned economic organization of a socialist state. The socialist state, they argued, would take control of economic life and coordinate the needs of peripheral regions with the interests of the state as a whole, serving all republics and, eventually, all laboring people. Ultimately, a rational colonization would increase the quantity and quality of all human beings on this earth and raise the level of culture. Experts were supposed to work together with locals who could provide knowledge about land and resources for the most effective extraction and the building of infrastructure. The local population should therefore be organized not on the basis of local nationalism, but in accordance with its economic orientation. Goskolonit supported the economic principle of Gosplan against the ethnographic principle of Narkomnats. Ultimately, a compromise between the two principles was implemented over the course of the 1920s and 30s. Soviet ethnographers worked for all three institutions. They predicted which peoples would merge into which nationalities and determined which population groups were best suited for particular forms of economic activity. This work had a profound impact on the Soviet regime's approach to its population for decades to come. One of the most important ethnographic projects was the All-Union Census. The first All-Union Census of 1926 was a monumental task for Soviet ethnographers. They faced the challenge of defining complex categories such as nation, race, and ethnicity in ways that were consistent with Marxist theory. They also had to design questionnaires, train census takers, resolve scientific debates, process vast amounts of data, and transform it into a coherent body of knowledge. Complicating matters, local elites often tried to manipulate the registration of nationalities to serve their own interests. Many rural residents struggled to understand the concept of nationality, and census takers frequently lacked sufficient knowledge of the cultures in their districts. Sometimes they just wrote down the exact words without really understanding them, and it would later turn out that the word they filled in for nationality actually translated to from here or from beyond the river, or it was just a family name. After the first all-union census was conducted, the Bolsheviks believed they had acquired enough knowledge about the peoples and territories of the empire to start an attack on the backwardness of certain populations and on the ethnographers of the old regime. The ex-Tsarist ethnographers, who had hoped to preserve their careers and their discipline, had little choice but to participate in the Sovietization of both the population and their science. In one sense, these scholars had more power than they could have ever dreamed of under the Tsarist regime. At the same time, however, they were completely at the Bolsheviks' mercy. All the work they had done to save the Soviet state-building project offered them no protection, because the regime no longer accepted mere political loyalty. It demanded full ideological commitment. By the late 1920s, the Bolsheviks purged educational and ethnographic institutions of bourgeois specialists. Many members of the older generation were demoted or arrested and replaced by younger ethnographers who were trained in materialism and fully aligned with Soviet ideology. When the Nazis seized power in Germany and ramped up the propagation of racial ideologies, the Bolsheviks perceived this as a major ideological threat to their ethnographic project. Soviet policy aimed to unify the diverse peoples of the USSR by accelerating historical development and bringing all groups to the same historical stage. Nazi race theory, by contrast, portrayed the peoples of the Soviet Union as composed of so-called inferior races, whose traits were fixed and unchangeable. Marxists argued that people of the same historical stage and social class shared more in common with each other than with members of their own ethnic or racial group who belonged to a different class. Soviet ethnographers, that is, the remaining demoted bourgeois specialists and newly trained communist scholars, actively resisted the rising influence of racial science. Amongst others, they referred to the famous study of Italian and Jewish immigrants in America by the German-American anthropologist Franz Boas from 1912, which was one of the best ethnographic studies of the time, showing the errors of race ideology. When the collectivization project ran into major problems, the Bolsheviks intensified their efforts to undermine race ideologies. They feared that the disastrous effects of collectivization could be cited by race theorists as evidence that certain people of the Russian Empire were inferior and biologically incapable of progress. Soviet propaganda instead framed these difficulties as the work of class enemies. If these enemies were eliminated, the peoples of the USSR could continue their historical evolution along the Marxist timeline that was explicated in journals, exhibitions, museums, textbooks, and propaganda posters. Ethnographers were sent out to identify the pre-capitalist and capitalist survivals that were obstructing this evolutionary progress. The Soviet ethnographers took over the concept of survivals from Edward B. Tyler. Survivals are cultural practices, beliefs, or customs from a previous historical stage that persist into a later stage of a society. The non-Bolshevik ethnographers did not necessarily believe that these survivals had to be eliminated. Some of them, like Nikolai Marr, even saw survivals as a legitimate part of modernity. However, in Marxist-Leninist theory, survivals became associated with anti-Soviet elements such as kulaks. These survivals had to be eliminated to accelerate the evolutionary progress of Soviet society. During collectivization, ethnographers began to actively intervene in the cultural life of the peoples they studied. They encouraged communities to compose folk songs, write poems, and produce other forms of cultural expression that are aligned with state propaganda. As Stalin famously declared, cultural production should be national in form but socialist in content. The result was a proliferation of folk songs and poems celebrating Lenin, rugs embroidered with Stalin's portrait, dances depicting collectivization, and folk tales about local socialist heroes. By the late 1930s, ethnographers faced even greater pressure from the Soviet government. The second all-union census, conducted in 1936, was a major state event. It was the first census under socialism and was intended not only to document the USSR's claimed progress, but also to signal to capitalist powers that the Soviet Union was growing stronger every year. Stalin proudly predicted that the census would show a population of around 180 million. In reality, the results revealed the devastating effects of famine and the terror campaigns. The population was only about 162 million. The census further revealed that religiosity remained widespread among the population. Ethnographers also identified roughly 100 distinct nationalities, while Stalin, in one of his speeches, claimed that the USSR had only about 60 nations. I don't know why Stalin suddenly stated this arbitrary number, but it was definitely not a good time to contradict anything Stalin said. The results of the census were kept from the public, and many statisticians, museum directors, and ethnographers were arrested and, in some cases, even executed. A new census was later conducted in 1939 under much tighter political control. Another form of pressure on Soviet ethnography came from the NKVD. The political police began persecuting people based on their nationality, treating entire groups as potential enemies of the state. In this context, the NKVD considered it illogical to allow individuals from these so-called enemy nations to self-identify their nationality. Instead, agents determined people's nationality themselves, using family history, language, place of birth, and other evidence. This practice directly contradicted official Soviet propaganda, which proudly claimed that citizens had the right to national self-identification, a claim widely used as anti-imperialist propaganda. Even Soviet children's stories emphasized this right as one of socialism's key achievements. Moreover, under the pressure of the NKVD, ethnographers erased the so-called enemy nations from textbooks and exhibitions that celebrated the fraternal friendship of the Soviet peoples. The Tsarist regime deliberately avoided aligning administrative divisions with ethnic territories when it divided the empire into around 90 administrative districts. This strategy was intended to limit the political power of local populations. When the Bolsheviks did the exact opposite and granted nations their own territory, it was also a deliberate strategy aimed at consolidating and centralizing their power. The Bolsheviks understood that to win the civil war and reunite the territories of the former Russian Empire, they had to collaborate with non-Bolshevik socialists and with non-socialist local elites in non-Russian regions. Whereas the imperial regime, the provisional government, and the white forces largely ignored the national question, the Bolsheviks incorporated it into both their ideology and their vision of a socialist state. Without the Soviet nationalities policy, the Bolsheviks would not have been able to reconquer and stabilize the empire. Although this outcome was not fully intended, the Soviet nationalities policy persisted until the dissolution of the USSR, and nationality became the most important official category of identity for Soviet citizens. In all of this, I found myself questioning the role of Russian nationalism. Was it also shaped by ethnographic knowledge? And did Soviet ethnographers intervene in the cultural production of Russians in the same way they did in non-Russian regions? Direct interference seems unlikely. Russians were generally regarded as a modern people, whereas ethnography primarily focused on so-called primitive or less developed groups. Moreover, during the early phase of Soviet nationalities policy, the active promotion of Russian nation-building was deliberately avoided, since Russian nationalism was perceived as the most dangerous internal threat to the Soviet project. Yet Lenin's fear of Russian nationalism was probably exaggerated. The results of the first Soviet census suggest that it was less widespread than he had anticipated. It was only after Stalin's reform of the nationalities policy in the 1930s that Russian nationalism gained significant momentum and became even stronger after Stalin's death. So I think one could reasonably argue that Russian nationalism itself was shaped and partly enabled by the Soviet nationalities policy. German nationalism was sparked by Napoleon's invasion, and the idea of a German nation was largely developed by linguists who constructed an ancient German language tradition. But this does not mean that the German nation is fake or that it was created out of thin air by a handful of linguists. Similarly, Lenin did not arbitrarily create nations out of nothing. He responded to widespread resistance among the diverse peoples of the Russian Empire. This resistance did not always express itself as nationalism, but over time it increasingly took nationalist forms. And the Bolsheviks decided to appease these movements by turning the peoples of the former Russian Empire into Soviet nations. Ethnographers played a central role in this project. In advising and implementing Soviet nationalities policy, they effectively created Soviet nations, including the Russian nation, by inscribing them into maps, censuses, and administrative records. Yet this was far from an arbitrary process. These nations emerged through the convergence of numerous heterogeneous elements, most of which predated the Soviet project and continue to shape identities long after the collapse of the Soviet Union.